sample or something to tell if there was a chemical or that would give you a key to if the bass were eating steelhead? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what Jim is mentioning is we did some stable isotope sampling. So, you know, what's the old phrase? You are what you eat, right?
Right.
So, you know, and that's, you can actually quantitatively use that to a certain degree to evaluate what animals are feeding on. And the way we did that in here is that the ocean, I'm not a chemist, so I'm gonna have to think through this a little bit, but there's elevated strontium levels in the ocean as compared to freshwater. So when anadromous fish, you know, meaning fish that are born in freshwater and go to the ocean, come back. When they go to the ocean, their strontium level is dramatically elevated compared to fish that stay in freshwater their whole life, or any animal that's living in, you know, any aquatic animal in freshwater. So steelhead go to the ocean and build up this huge fat reserve that's really strontium rich, and then when they come back, they're in freshwater for 8 or 9 months, and so they're basically digesting that strontium fat, and you know, the fat that's really strontium rich, and then converting that into eggs. And so the eggs have a higher strontium signature than other fish in here, and that's maintained through the very early phases of exogenous feeding, which is when the fry emerge from the gravel. So they're in the gravel for about 30 days, and they're just developing based on the food supply from their mothers. The egg, which was formed from ocean nutrients, so it has an elevated strontium signature, and then that's signature stays in their body for a few days at least after they emerge, because then they start feeding on freshwater, very, very small macroinvertebrates, and so that saltwater, the strontium signal eventually fades out through time, you know, really through just a couple of weeks of freshwater feeding, because they're turning over their tissue material so rapidly when they're, you know, when they're 30 millimeters. But so yeah, sorry, circle back around to you.
Yeah.
So we were collecting smallmouth bass, fin clipping bass, and then with those fin clips of bass, we could identify the strontium levels in bass, and it was higher in fish that had access that were in 30 Mile Creek, significantly higher in here than it was in bass that were in the main stem John Day a little ways upstream. And so that kind of created that's indirect evidence that those fish were preying on steelhead fry, and that was causing the spike in, you know, the change in that signal here. And then since then we've caught bass in here, and as part of the exclosure experiment, we've caught bass and killed them and sampled their stomach, and yeah, just fry in there. When they're steelhead fry are emerging here, and bass.
That was a lot less complicated than checking for strontium.
It was, yeah, yeah, but
the strontium is good science. That's good.
Yeah, so that's, you know, that's a thing where, you know, we could go around and, you know, if you look, talking again about the kind of the global scale, like we can't do a WRC experiment necessarily everywhere, but we can go around and check for, it's pretty easy to go around and grab some bass and take fin clips and check for that, you know, see if there's potential evidence of them feeding on a recently emerged salmonid, and then if there is, then get into the...
What's a WRC that excludes bass and not steelhead lipless?
Just the key here is timing. So we put it in after steelhead have come up, adults have come up, and steelhead smolts have migrated downstream, and then check, you know, routinely on both the up and down side to make sure. So it's basically a blockage to fish movement.
Oh, so okay. So if a steelhead happened to come up, or what, you know, late one or something, they wouldn't be able to get up either.
We come down and check, and if we see that, we can open the pickets and get them up. But yeah, we're trying to use time to, you know, exclude, because usually most of the steelhead are through here before early May, and then the bass start coming up in mid-May when the water warms a little bit. But yeah, it's not a perfect, just kind of threading the needle scenario never works out exactly perfect.
How often do you guys come down? Whoops.
usually every a couple days we'll come down and check.
So since summer steelhead seems to be a very threatened species right now, and since your bass is an invasive species that has gotten into the millions, is there any desire to, and we know that they like smolts, are we going to be reducing the bass in this river?
Well,
it
we've
seems like
taken-
that's one thing. I mean, we don't know why steelhead returns have been so bad, but it seems like anything we could do to improve that return would be helpful. So what's ODFW's thoughts about increasing this to no limit of, or even being more aggressive to getting rid of the large number of bass that we have?
Right, we're already there on. There's no bag limit for bass right now.
Good.
It's been that way for 5 or 6 years. I can't remember the exact period. So yeah, we're already there. Whether there's a social dynamic there too of not everybody is capitalizing on that. There's still a lot of catch and release of bass in the river. But the recent again, if you look at the global long-term average, there's lots of factors driving the steelhead decline. If you just want to look at last year, the key factor was ocean survival. And there's really hasn't been a huge discernible change we've been monitoring survival of steelhead and salmon migrating from the headwaters down to First Dam on the Columbia since the early 2000s. And in that period, there's not a discernible trend in survival. I mean, there's ups and downs, right? And low flow years and high flow years, there's ups and downs in survival, but there's not a clear, trend down or up in terms of their survival through this corridor. So there's no evidence that there's a dramatic change in the last 20 years of how bass and steelhead or salmon are interacting in the main stem, but of course we don't have data from that survival type data from the 50s and 60s prior to bass introduction either.
So we don't know what harm is done to begin with.
Yeah, but so the really low adult return last year was the long-term average in survival for John Day steelhead from the first dam they encounter at John Day Dam. Their survival going from there down to the ocean, all around the ocean, back to Bonneville Dam. The first one coming back up as an adult. Long-term average is about 3.5% of the fish, the smolts that arrive at John Day make that trip all the way back to Bonneville. For the fish that entered the ocean in 2019 and 2020, it was less than 1%.
Wow.
For the 2019 fish, it was like half of 1%.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was dramatic, by far the lowest. Those were the first 2 years we've ever seen lower than 2% survival for smolt to adult survival for John Day steelhead.
Yeah.
So that's, I don't want to minimize all those other factors. The reason we usually have 50,000 wild steelhead in the Columbia Basin as compared to 500,000 historically, is driven by lots of things. But the reason we went from 50,000 to 19,000 last year was mainly because of the ocean
Is
conditions.
that the warming conditions that were happening? Don't know for sure.
Yeah, potential effects of the long-term effects of the blob and steelhead. The blob, steelhead use the center of the ocean to the best of our knowledge. So the center is the least productive part, and so it's probably the most susceptible to warming. And then there's also, it seems kind of counterintuitive since we hear that salmon and steelhead are endangered everywhere, and they are, but we're pumping at a global scale. We're pumping more juvenile salmon and steelhead into the ocean now than may have occurred historically. A large part of that is from far north pink and chum releases. So there's some evidence too that we're maybe overstocking the ocean. So
With pinks and chums.
So
There's only so much you can put on the pasture.
yeah, exactly. And then
Yeah,
as
I
you
guess so,
as you get these marine heat waves and the
Yeah.
productivity of the pasture goes down, but our stocking density is going up or flat at this super high level, the steelhead may be one of the more susceptible salmonins to that.
What's your average number of spawners coming back into to 30 mile?
To 30 mile?
Yeah.
I think we've done spawning ground surveys here in the reach from the mouth up to the bridge there at the high bridge there on Highway 19 since 2017, and I want to say it's varied from about 200 to 600.
Okay. Huh.
So yeah, I don't know the average off the top of my head
Okay,
for
what's
you,
in
but
that range?
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe 100 to 600 in that range, and that's I guess you keep in mind that's since 2017 we've been in a fairly low abundance at the kind of the global scale.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, you could see potentially high hundreds to 1,000 or more.
You guys were talking about the beaver pond analogs. Is that some of the techniques that you're looking at for this stream to be able to say you're trying to increase miles of stream for spawning availability?
Yeah, trying to establish beaver dam analogs to extend these riparian areas, because this is the areas with this intact riparian habitat are where the parr can survive during the summer, and it's also where the majority of the steelhead are spawning. And I don't know the exact mechanism that's creating that, that association or that correlation, but it may be because in these cobble reaches like this, as you look down here, the areas that are losing reaches hydraulically, where the water is falling through them, are like what Josh mentioned. They have these really big cobbles, and you look down here and you can see these, mainly volleyball sized cobbles, and that's not spawning habitat for steelhead. So they just may not be able to find suitable size material in these reaches where they're currently.
Yeah, where they could be digging nests.
Yeah. So that most of the spawning is close to these groves of alder, where they have a lot of structure. They're slowing the water. They're trapping the marble to golf ball sized gravel along the edges, and that's where steelhead are spawning, is in that small gravel right along the edge.
Is salmon ever spawn in here too?
We've never seen any salmon spawn in here. I don't know, historically, I don't know. We have seen some juvenile. We've caught a few juvenile Chinook salmon rearing during the summertime in 30 Mile Creek. Some late migrating Chinook that were moving down the John Day, and then as it warms up, they'll hit a thermal block at some point and be forced to kind of get out of Dodge to wherever they can. It's cooler.
So Ian, you mentioned that the historic average of the return rate was around 3 or 3.5% or something like that, and then we had those terrible years where it went down to less than 1%. Do you have a sense of what percentage return is considered sustainable? What would be increasing? What would be decreasing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're kind of driving out what is replacement for the population, right?
Yeah.
If you get one steelhead to spawn here, how many offspring does it produce? And that's, you need to integrate both the freshwater survival and the ocean survival to know that. So basically, that's kind of the holy grail of what everybody's striving for is a life cycle model where you can parameterize, you can say, all right, a female comes in here, female steelhead have about 4,000 eggs. It's a really rough average, anywhere from 3 to 6,000 probably. So if a female comes in here and lays 4,000 eggs, how many of those, what's the egg to fry survival? And it's probably 5 or 10% perhaps, which is, so then you have, it's 10%, then you have 400 fry, and then what's the fry to parr, fry to the end of the first year survival, and then what's the, so maybe that's 10% too. So now you're down to 40 fish, and then if they're smolting at age 1, what's their survival from here to the dam, and then what is it from there through the ocean? So I guess the answer is it depends.
It's a good numbers game though.
So you can, that's a good, that's a good point. It's like we don't have a clear cut, at a super high policy level. The Power Planning Council has set like a 2 to 4% survival goal for fish leaving the Snake River hydro system, upstream of the Snake River hydro system, which they very seldomly achieve 2% there,
Huh.
and it's part of why those populations are, potentially on a worse trajectory than the John Day, because the John Day, at 3.5% long-term average, it's right in that range of 2 to 4.
Yeah.
But you have to think about, like, if freshwater conditions in the John Day were to decline, and you had extended periods of drought, which is very susceptible to that, especially here because we're so low and we're shielded by the Cascades. A lot less moisture is dropped here than it is further north or further east.
Uh-huh.
So if your freshwater conditions really decline to where you're only getting, from that one female, you're only getting 10 smolts down to John Day Dam, then you need to be in the 10% survival to get one adult back,
Yeah.
right? Or it's just
Boy,
a total
scary
total
numbers.
hypothetical, but and so to that extent, we can't really, there's only so many levers we can do on the ocean, so we need to try to lever this, move this lever up as much as we can, so that we're, even if that survival in the ocean declines through time, or we have more of these really poor years, then we just need to be cranking out more fish from here.
Gotcha. Well, and you had mentioned how some steelhead, after they spawn, they'll go back out to the ocean, and some folks aren't aware that steelhead can do that. That they're not like other Pacific salmon that die after spawning.
Yeah.
And
Steelhead or Iteroparis instead of Semelparis.
okay, gotcha. And they can do that more than once.
Yes, they can, in theory. I mean, especially in coastal populations where the access is easier, they can go in and out multiple times. And
Interesting.
that's probably been most documented in the Kamchatka populations of steelhead, where there's, many steelhead and little fishery impact and little human impact. But yeah, it is possible for fish to do that in Oregon and Washington as well.
So if a 30-mile steelhead was inclined to go back out to the ocean and after spawning, and they've got 3 dams to navigate on their way back to the ocean, what does that look like? I know our upstream passage has been really engineered and dialed in. What's the downstream passage for adults look like?
Yeah, there's several routes downstream. Their routes and options are basically the same for adults or juveniles. And so when they come down to a dam, they can either go through the turbines, which is, the turbines are located really low on the dams. Dams are about 100 feet high. Turbines are at the bottom, so they can go through the intakes and down through the turbines. A lot of the John Day steelhead actually go past the mouth of the river and then get up to McNary, above McNary Dam, and have to come back. And there's the Corps has been working on that, and there's about 10% mortality impact for an adult steelhead going through the turbines. So it's about 90% survival if they go through the turbines, basically 100 if they go over the top. So they can go through the turbines, they can get screened. There's screens on most of the turbines now, so which force fish into what's called the juvenile bypass system. At some of the dams you can see this big pipe going around the side. That's the juvenile bypass system. So not super ideal for a 30-inch steelhead to be going through a pipe like that, but they can do that. And then they can go the standard spillway. Standard spillway doesn't really look like it when you're driving on the 84, but the spillway is about 40 feet under 30 to 40 feet under the surface of the reservoir. So, and this both adult and juvenile steelhead in the reservoirs are really surface oriented. So it's 100 feet deep in the forebays, but they're in the top like 5 feet of the water. Swimming around in the top 5 or 6 feet of water. So they really don't like diving down to go into the deep, what's called the deep spill. But there's also these things called temporary spillway weirs that you can see them at several of the dams, where it's basically kind of raises up that spillway crest, so water is spilling over at about 15 feet deep. And that's the best. That's the best passage option for adult steelhead going downstream, and really for juveniles going downstream too. So.
So when you go by the dam and you see just one of those channels is opened and they're just pouring kind of a smooth tongue of water over it, that's probably for fish passage over the top.
Yeah, yeah. Unless we're in a kind of uncontrolled spill situation because of a big amount of rain, or that happened last late fall for a little while when there's like those massive rainstorms in northern Washington. There was some spill opened up then just because the system. I mean, the main stem dams are run on the river, so they can't store a lot of water. So if they have to, that rain came in below the storage dams, and so they had to kind of pass it through the system. But in general, the spill is being done because of the ESA listings and court action to move fish over the dams.
Gotcha.
So the steelhead are Iteroparis in here, and it's kind of a sex differentiated thing too. The female steelhead are much more likely to respawn than males, so kind of creates some challenges for monitoring on our side of things. But we've worked with fishing guides when the season's been open to collect adult scales, because you can look at the scale pattern on the steelhead scales and see which ones are respawners, because they're coming in and they spend 10 months in freshwater. They're basically digesting themselves for 10 months, and so the scale kind of shrinks into, you can see kind of and then they go back to the ocean and grow a little bit, and the scale grows out a little bit more, but you can look at the scale and see a really like jagged thin line where the fish basically just like went on the 10-month fast there.
Wow.
So
You got a sense for what percentage of first-time spawners survive for the spawning time for steelhead? I mean, not all of them survive, right?
No.
Yeah.
Survival in the tributaries is actually really high, because it's very rare to find carcasses, steelhead carcasses.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't know if that's, we don't have a super great sense of whether that's because survival is really high or it's really hard to find fish when the flow is high like this. It's probably a combination of both, but yeah, the majority of the fish, I would say, survive spawning and start making it back into the river.
Wow.
They're really, they're really in rough shape at that point. So I think a lot of them die in the Columbia, and there probably would have been a lot of that mortality historically, even without hydro impacts, because it's 10 months without eating. It'll put anybody in a little bit of a rough spot.
So it's interesting that the females are more likely to go back out to sea after spawning, because I would think spawning is metabolically so much more expensive for them than the males.
Yeah, it is kind of paradoxical, but they spawn and then they leave right away, because they are, as soon as they get the last eggs out, they're gone. Males never really spawn out, so
They just won't stop.
That's right. Oh boy, one more time.
Their strategy is more of the kind of the all-in, right? It's like, just keep trying, keep cruising. You can see males pretty commonly, see them just cruising up and down the stream all spring, when the water's low and clear, and just waiting for one more chance. So they just get to a point, and they're also competing with other males for access. So they're, you can see 2 or 3 males, fighting basically for a position with a female, and so they're bashing into each other, and they'll get fungus and scrapes and scars all over their back, and that then you start getting infections there, and it's pretty tough.
Wow.